is a 1970 429 Ford Torino Cobra Jet, and it's coming up right now on this episode of Tested Muscle. Tested Muscle is presented by American Collectors Insurance.
Repair shop of choice, agreed value coverage, mileage tiers, and over 40 years of experience. That's what makes America's Collectors Insurance the #1 rated collector insurance company with 5-star reviews nationwide.
On this episode of Tested Muscle, we've got this beautiful 1970 Ford Torino Cobra Jet 429. And let me tell you something, this is one hell of a car. Oh.
My name is Michael Brown. The car is a 1970 Torino Cobra 429 Cobra Jet. What drew me to the Torino was the fact that my dad always fancied himself as he loved Fords, and he always bought the biggest, baddest Ford he could afford.
Owner Mike Brown purchased this car back in 1992 after growing up in the back seat of a 1970 Ford Torino GT 429 Super Cobra Jet that his dad purchased brand new in 1970. However, after the car had been off the road since 1974, he decided to embark on a full 2-year restoration. Work commenced on the hood, front bumper, front fender, and the car received a complete paint job with its royal maroon color that it still has today. A shaker hood and rear window sport slats were also added, which were common options for the 1970 sports roof Torinos. The goal was keeping the car as close to the one that his dad had back in 1970, as keeping it original was basically like a snapshot back to the 70s. As for the interior of the car, well, that's all original, and Mike saw no reason to change what is basically, in our eyes, well, Torino perfection. The exterior is racy and simplistic, which was a theme for the Torino Cobra, and it was only offered in a sports roof. Crisp body lines were punctuated by a sharply pointed leading edge on the front fenders, flanking a blacked-out recessed grille with exposed quad headlamps. Let's also not forget that glorious shaker hood, the integrated rear spoiler, and the obvious Cobra decals on the front fenders and on the rear deck. Color-keyed racing mirrors were also sporty and standard on all Torino Cobras as well.
My favorite part about owning a 70 Torino Cobra is nobody has one, and it is truly a performance car built by the Ford Motor Company. And in 1970, Ford just kind of dropped out of racing. They just killed their whole program. And it's pretty close to the pinnacle of 70s performance. That makes the car very special. Plus, it's an easy driving and a pleasure drive.
The second generation Ford Torino ran for only 2 years, 1970 and 1971. Gone were the boxy, squared-off lines of its predecessor, and in its place was a more sculpted, aerodynamic shape that utilized a more Coke bottle design. A long hood, raked windshield, and sleeker rear sports roof design gave the car a much more aggressive look and feel, especially when combined with the Cobra options package. All Torino Cobras came with what Ford called competition suspension, along with additional Cobra features that included the racing black hood, grille, and tail lamp panel trim. Then there were Ford's twist-off style hood pins, and the Cobra decals, well, that were downright discreet, especially when compared to the multicolor graphics that were found on other factory supercars. The interior carried snake emblems on the door panels and a cool Cobra plaque on the dashboard, which was in place of the standard Torino plaque. Now, for many, the Torino was a wonderful alternative to the Ford Mustang. Sure, it was a bit more mature in stature, and while its lines were racy, there was also a simplicity in its overall design.
Let's talk about the interior for a second. Now, we're sitting in these wonderful high-back bucket seats, but what I always find interesting about cars from the 60s were where the seats do move forward and back, there is no recline feature. 90% are fixed back, so while I have kind of ample leg room, I am very close up against the steering wheel, where a manual recline would be unbelievably welcome in cars of this age. The dashboard, super clean. We've got our Cobra emblem over to the right, and then the pod is really truly driver-centric, but it's minimal, very minimal. I have my big speedometer, I've got a fuel gauge and a temp gauge, and that's really it. Now, yes, there is a tach, but the tach is off to the left. and on the bottom of the dash, where you can't really see it, especially when you drop a gear and take off. So it's kind of like an afterthought. It's kind of like the designers were like, hey, maybe we should put a tach in this car, especially since we put this big honking motor in there. And they said, well, we're out of room. And then somebody was like, well, why don't we put it over there? And then somebody else said, yeah, that's fine. And that's what they did. I don't agree with the placement, but it's right there, so I'm showing it to you. As for the radio, passenger has no choice. But it does have an AM/FM stereo right down here. Very intuitive, right next to the cigarette lighter. And, you know, again, minimalistic dash, super, super intuitive and clean. And that's one of the things I really like about this. If you really wanted to go highbrow with your Torino, you could have optioned it with air conditioning. You could have put power steering in it. And the steering wheel with the rim blow horn is also a very cool feature. Just thinks that's kind of slick. I don't know. You know, we talked about the Torino being the more mature option to the Ford Mustang. And it really is. I mean, this is a gentleman's muscle car. What I love is the center console. This is a really nicely sculpted piece with your T-handle shifter right here. The other thing is, this is a very usable car. Your back seats have room to put people in. And while the headroom isn't tremendous in the back due to kind of the sloped rear roof, there's plenty of room to put people back there. Again, usable car. Where the Mustang was compact and tight, the Torino is a full-size car that you could drive every day and fully enjoy. What makes a Cobra Jet a Cobra Jet? Well, obviously, it's the 429 under the hood, right? You're talking about a big 7-liter V8, 370 horsepower, 450 pound-feet of torque. And I'll tell you, it goes. It goes through a C6 3-speed transmission. Well, it's an automatic. And when you put your foot down, man, it kicks and it pulls and pulls and pulls. And it will pull well past that 120-mile-an-hour speedometer if you have the right gears in it. What's even better about it is that even by today's standards, with that much horsepower and that much torque, it is totally usable. Now, if you were to buy this car and you wanted to, say, daily it or just have some fun with it, an extra gear is always welcome, right? And you could fix that one by doing a different transmission or putting a different set of rear end gears. Now, out back, we do have a Ford 9-inch with some 370s, so they're pretty steep. So you don't really want to cruise this at 80 miles an hour. But I'll tell you, it runs along just fine at 60 miles an hour, which we were doing before, and we were running at about 3,000 RPMs, which was just fine. The other part about this car, Mike did a tremendous job on the restoration. There is not a squeak, there is not a rattle, there is nothing loose or falling off. It is a prime example of when you restore a car, it's attention to detail. It's attention to every little nut, bolt, screw, making sure they're torqued correctly. Because in a 53-year-old car, for nothing to rattle, that, my friends, is a massive, massive achievement. Now let's talk about the brakes. So this car did come equipped with power disc brakes. We've got 11.3-inch discs in the front and 10-inch drums out back. So how does it stop? Well, if we jump on the binders, you know what? For 1970, not bad. For 2023, kind of bad. But I mean, it's a 53-year-old muscle car, you know? And that's kind of the cool part about these things. When you drive these cars, you realize how analog they are. You realize how there is no anti-lock brakes, there is no traction control, there is no, any recovery devices of any kind. So if you get this thing out of whack, it's up to you here to bring it back. Muscle cars, old cars, classic cars, they teach you how to drive because you have to. You don't have an option other than to drive them, And I know that sounds weird, but we're living in a world now with some vehicles claiming they're autonomous, which we know doesn't exist. And, it's kind of nice. It's kind of nice to be fully aware and not have 27 screens that sparkle the dashboard with all these lights and stuff. This is back to basic driving, and you know what? It's just so good, man. It's so good. As far as the body and suspension, this is a unibody car, which means there is no separate frame underneath it. Suspension-wise, we've got torsion bar with springs up front, a Ford 9-inch out back with leaf springs. With the competition package, both front and rear springs were heavy duty. When it comes to the exterior of the Torino, this is a really kind of grown-up, elegant, masculine car. The rear sports roof is beautifully designed. The rear louvers are just kind of iconic. A little bit of 70s camp there, which is cool. But up front is really where the action is. We've got, the shaker hood, and I love a shaker. Any car with a shaker on it, I'm just a sucker for. Whether you're sitting in a light, whether you're on the gas, watching that thing jiggle and move is just a hell of a lot of fun. The other part is the twist hood pins that are, kind of iconic Ford staples on these cars. Everybody else with the big cables coming around, Ford was like, nah, we're gonna do it bottle cap style. Boom, boom, done. You don't have to worry about cables scratching the paint, and it's just kind of a really great and simplistic design. If you're thinking of buying a Torino, here are some key spots to look for some rust. Lower quarter panels, bottom of the doors, around the rear window trim, and the shock towers. So where do you go to look for a Torino? Well, you obviously go to Hemmings. You go to the auctions, you go to our classifieds, and then of course you're gonna need insurance. So who do you go to? It's obvious, you go to American Collectors Insurance. They go, you talk to them, you get your agreed value on the car, and boom, you are ready to hit the road. That, my friends, is how it's done. Mike Brown went through painstaking efforts to make sure that this car drove well, and not only does it drive well, it drives great. There is not a squeak, there is not a rattle. The car handles beautifully, it rides beautifully. It's very quiet inside. In fact, when you roll the windows all the way up, you'd be hard pressed to hear the exhaust. It's kind of weird coming from a muscle car with 370 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque. But I understand it, I get it. I feel like an adult. I feel like somebody who's, they've gone through life, they've made their money, and they didn't want to be abused in their weekend car or their daily driver. They wanted to go out and actually enjoy it while still having that mega punch under the hood. And that's the great part about the Torino. This is a car you simply don't see every day. In fact, you hardly ever see them at all. And I granted, it was only a 2-year car, but they're so good. They're so good. Like if you haven't thought about one, look at them, uncover them, take one for a test drive if you possibly can. Folks, this is a fabulous overlooked automobile. In fact, I'm even gonna go so far to say is this is what the Mustang wanted to be when it grew up. Torino. Here are my closing thoughts on the Torino. This is an overlooked muscle car that is well worth your attention. If you've always wanted a Mustang and the prices have gone ballistic, if you've always wanted other muscle cars that might be out of your reach, I'm not saying these cars are super affordable, but they're more affordable than some of their counterparts. This is a executive motor car with a hell of a lot of muscle behind it. It has all the go fast goodies, from the big 429 to the transmission to the big Ford 9-inch Outback, and it's just comfortable. It's a nice place to be. And if it's anything, like this, it drives spectacular. Hell, the only thing I would do to this car, honestly, is I would put air conditioning in it and I would drive it as a daily, because I'll tell you, it's that comfortable and it's that refined. Thank you to Mike Brown for bringing out the Torino and letting us drive it, and obviously thank you to the Gilmore Auto Museum as always. You guys have some amazing cars, you guys have an amazing campus. For those that have never been to the Gilmore, go there. Go there, it's in Hickory Corners, Michigan, check it out. It will be one of your top automotive experiences, I promise you.